Functions in programming are essential for making anything that's even remotely complex. So today what we're going to do is break down what functions are in GameMaker Studio, how they work, some of the useful ones, and how to really use them in your game. Let's go ahead and jump in. So we've got our project from the last part, and what I'm going to do is just start using some functions inside of here, because I think the best way to understand how they work is to just see them in action. So first though, let me show you how to type one out. We've done variables before, and a function is kind of like a built-in variable. It has a specific name. You must type it in that way. So it's like this. If we wanted to get a random number in our game, we could use the function random. Now it's going to come in, it's going to say function right here. It lists a bunch of random functions, and it has a special syntax that you have to follow. So you give it the name, and it turns orange or kind of yellowish depending on your screen. And then we have to open it up with a parenthesis. Now that is Shift 9 on your keyboard. You open it up, and now down here we can actually see the name of the function, and there's something inside of it that tells us what we should put inside of there. Now we're not actually putting the number x or the letter x here. It actually is a number because it's a built-in variable, but don't worry about that. We don't actually want x inside of here. X here is an argument or a parameter. It means that we want to pass something into here so that we get something back. But we're going to control what we get back based on what we put in. So for this function called random, it will return a random number from 0 all the way up to whatever we put as the cap. So if I say 10, this function will never give us anything bigger than 10. I'm not even sure it will give us 10. It might. Let's actually take a look at that. And to figure that out, if we hover over the function, you either double click or just click on it once so that you're inside of it, your cursor's in there, and then we press F1 on your keyboard. Not F and 1 at the same time. You actually push the F1, which stands for the function 1 key. If you're on a laptop, you might need to actually hold down an extra key to turn your top row of numbers into your function keys, just so you know. But F1 will bring up this manual. This manual is really awesome, which I've already touched on. So for the functions, it's actually going to describe and show you exactly how to use them. So random, this function is good for probabilities where returning an integer, whole number is not necessary. So this is kind of important. It's not going to return an integer, which means that if we say random 10, it can actually be an almost infinite number of values between 0 and 10 because it goes to decimal points of what looks like 7 or 8 points. So that means that if you want a whole number, you need to use a different function, which I'll show you later. So for now, random 100 will return 0 to 99. So it doesn't actually include that top value, which is really good to know. And it shows you, here's the argument, which this one looks like it's a little out of place. We might want to actually report this to Yo-Yo saying that in the manual it says N, but in GameMaker it actually says X. That's a little inconsistency, but for the most part, the manual and functions are exactly the same. So it has the argument, and then the upper range from which the random number will be selected. It tells you what it returns, which we'll talk about, and it gives you an example, and then it explains that. Okay, so that's everything we need to know about the random function. So random, we put a number in there, and then we close it with the rightmost parenthesis, which is Shift and 0 on your keyboard, and semicolon. Now, if we run our game, let's see what happens. We should have a random number, which, yeah, okay, nothing happened. We called the function, we got a random number, but nothing happened. And that's because we didn't do anything with the random number. It returns to us a number, but we don't save it, we don't store it, we don't use it. It is basically gone forever. So instead, let's use this. I'm going to highlight it, press Control X to cut it out. And instead of our move speed being 9, let's go ahead and put our move speed in at a random 10. But I'm actually going to bump this up to 100. That way we really get a big random number here. So let's run this. And now if I move, you can see that my speed is totally different. It is not 9, it's significantly faster. Now, if I were to continually run this over and over again, it actually is going to produce the exact same result every single time. And that's because GameMaker uses what's called a set seed when you run your game every time. So the randomness in your game is actually the same. That way you can debug it and test it really easily. But to get around that, we can actually use another function. So before we call this function, I'm going to call Randomize. And so this function doesn't take any arguments. All you got to do is call it. It doesn't return anything. You just type this out, open and close parentheses. You still have to have those inside of there. And then this is going to actually give us a new number every time we run our game. So let's try that. Let's press F5 and try out our speed. Okay, so that's not near as fast as what we had before. Let's try it again and see what we get. Now it's a lot slower, and we could do this forever and ever and get an infinite amount of numbers inside of here. So, randomize doesn't take any arguments. Random does take an argument, and it returns a value that we need to catch in order to actually do something with it. Now, if you're getting an error, it might be because you forgot to close it. If you forget to close it, you're going to get this red syntax error said expected expression. Not the most useful error, but GameMaker does do something helpful in that it highlights all of your opening and closing brackets, parentheses, curly braces. So that means that when you have one of them, you should have a second one that's highlighted. If we come over here to randomize, you can see it's red, it's not blue, it doesn't have a matching one. Every time you open it, you must then close it. That's just the rule in programming. Sometimes you might close it later on, but it must be closed for it to work properly. So, randomize and random, two pretty useful functions that you might actually find yourself using. But let's take a look at some of the other really useful ones that we're going to do. I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a new event. It's going to be a key pressed, and we'll just do spacebar. So this will trigger one time whenever we press space. And what this event is going to do is we're going to create a new player. So while our game is running, we can actually create and destroy instances in our room. Right now, in our room, we just have one of them. That's it, just the player, nothing else in there. But it might be kind of fun to have lots of players. So the function for this, which we're going to use quite often, is called instance underscore. The way GameMaker's built-in functions work is that they use underscore for spaces because you can't have spaces in function names, variable names, anything like that. Instance underscore create underscore layer. Open up the parenthesis, and now you're going to see there's actually quite a few arguments here. So a function can have as little as 0 and as many as a dozen or more, because you can actually write your own functions. Later on, we're going to do this. But the GameMaker ones, I think the most is like 8 to 10, depending on the function, which is pretty uncommon. Most of the time, it's 2 to 5. This one has 4. So we open it up with a bracket, with a parenthesis here, and it tells us we need an x coordinate. Now, in this case, this actually does need to be where we want to put it in our room with the x coordinate, so the horizontal. The reason I know that is because I've used this function so many times, and I've come in here and I've read this manual layer instance create so many times, like I have it down. But for the first time you use it, definitely open up the manual and check it out. So the first argument is the x, and this says the x position the object is created. Then we have y, which is the y position. Layer ID is the name of the layer where we're going to create it, and I'll explain that in just a second. Object means the object that we want to make. So we want to make our player. We already know that. So where do we want to make it? Well, we could give it a simple number like 100, which we'll do for first. Yeah, let's do that. Let's just do 100 and 100 for the X and Y coordinates. No problem. Now, how do we know the layer ID or name? Well, if we have our room open, the layers are over here on the left. And if you can't see these for any reason, you can always come up to room and we can reset Windows on current desktop, and that will put your format, your layout exactly like this, because we need to actually see this one. So we're looking for the layer with the two little circles. That is our instances layer, which has all of our instances, which are objects in here. And we're looking for the name of that. So I'm going to go back over here, and in quotes, so I'm going to make a string. So in quotes here, I'm going to type out the layer name, which is INSTANCES, which is the word instances. Now, something I'm doing in here, which I haven't mentioned yet, and I definitely should, is between every single argument that we put in here, you need to have a comma. A comma indicates that you're moving on to the next argument. So the first one here, if we look down, the X is highlighted, and that means that this is the X coordinate. After you put a comma down, now this whole section is on Y. Now X is also highlighted here, but Y is the most recent highlighted one, like we're moving to the right here. That's how you know that you're on Y. If we go over another one, here's the layer ID or name. And lastly is object. Now you don't have to have spaces in between these. I highly encourage you to. It makes reading them significantly easier. And it's kind of just the norm to have spaces in there. But again, GameMaker's a computer. Like, it doesn't care if it can read it logically, it will. The spaces, the comments, all of that is for us. So now we're on the last argument, and we need the object. We only have one, so it's going to be obj player. We close it up, put a semicolon, and now, if we run our game and we hit spacebar, we're going to create a new player. And now, each one of these actually has a random move speed associated, because every time we create a player, it randomly gets a different move speed, which is kind of fun. Now, we're actually getting a lot of players in here, so why is that? I'm only pressing space once. Well, I've pressed it like 3 times now. But the reason for that is this code for space is in every single one of these player objects. So this one, 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 this one will all make a new player when I press spacebar. Now they create them all in the exact same spot, but as soon as I move, you can see there's a lot of players. So that's kind of fun. And it shows the instance create layer function, which is really helpful, and we're going to use this really often. And how to use arguments. So we have to have commas in between them. You gotta have brackets in here. If you forget to type one in here, well, it's going to come up with a warning. It's going to tell you that it expected 4 arguments, but it only got 3. This is, I think, a pretty useful argument. It means that you need to add another argument. Now we can try to run this, but our game is not going to compile and run because it tells us we're actually missing one of them. Now, if you type in your object wrong, or you typed in your sprite, like if I typed in SPR player here instead of my object, then that warning will go away and our game is going to compile. But if we press space now, well, it created it, but it only actually made it because of the very specific circumstances that we have inside of here. In general, this will actually fail because sprite player, the way GameMaker does things in the background, SPR player is a number. OBJ player is actually just a number that GameMaker has stored. In this very specific case, this works, which is kind of unfortunate. So let me see if I can make this not work, because 99% of the time this will fail. So let me fill this in really quick and just try this. Let's go back to player. Now, there's 2 sprites, SPR player is the second sprite. So let's run this, and I'll press spacebar, and nothing is happening. So now SPR player is not the same number essentially as OBJ player, so it doesn't make it. Now your game compiles and runs, but when we press space, nothing occurs because you can't create a sprite when you're supposed to make an object. That's a pretty common error that will happen. The other one is if your object is misspelled and it comes in as blue. Now a lot of times you're going to get a warning saying that you've never referenced this object that you're trying to make, and that should be a clue for you that if you've never referenced it before, you shouldn't be using it in any event other than the create where you actually are making that event, where you're making that variable, sorry. So if we try to run this now, we'll get an error when we actually press spacebar. Because OBJ player with a lowercase p is not set before reading it, we cannot create something from it because it has no value. So make sure that when you're creating an object, it is your object, and it is your object spelled correctly, not a sprite. So make sure those things happen. Now, same thing over here. If we mistype our layer name, we're not going to get any sort of warning because this is actually just a string, and GameMaker can't tell what's inside of it from here. And if we press space, it's going to tell us that the instance layer does not exist. And that's because the layer is called instances. Now we can rename our layer, and now it's called the instance layer. And if we run this, it will work perfectly fine. But you must have the exact same name as your layer here. The other really cool thing to note is you can actually put functions inside of functions. So we've used the random function, so let's try that again. Instead of 100, let's put random 500. And let's put random 500. And now when we run this and we call this function, we're going to create our player somewhere random every single time, which is kind of fun. Now you can see where the bounding box is, essentially right here and here. So if we wanted to do it larger or across the whole room, we could do that too. Some of the built-in variables that are in GameMaker can be really helpful when it comes to room sizes and information like that. So the X value that we want is the width of our room. Now we could type in 1366, or we could type in the built-in value, room underscore width. Same thing for the height. We can type room underscore height. The reason that's useful is if we ever wanted to change the size of our room, we don't actually have to change the size of our code. Sorry, we don't have to change the code that we have here because these values will always be the exact same as our width and our height. So if we run this now, we'll be able to create our player object anywhere inside of our room. And there we go. That's a lot of players. Okay, that is a basic rundown of functions. So we know how to call them, we know how to pass arguments in and get their value back and do something with it. And we looked at some of the most useful functions like instance create layer that we're going to be using inside of our game. And we showed how to use these functions inside of other functions. So if you have any questions about functions, let me know. Hit me up down in the comments below. I'll be happy to help. So what we're going to start doing next is actually developing our own game from scratch. That game is going to be a Flappy Bird clone game. Now, it's kind of a simple game, but the thing is, it's going to teach us everything we need to know how to do all the basic things that will be in pretty much every game you're going to make. So we're going to have options that we can change. We're going to have a GUI. We're going to have some cool parallax background effects. We're going to have a high score that you can actually save and load in your game. And then we'll have the whole gameplay loop itself as well, with really cool effects throughout the whole thing, the ability to restart your game, and you can see how far you can get inside of here. So we'll set up collisions. We're going to talk about more functions, parents, inheritance, saving, and loading, all of that stuff inside of here over the course of the next, I think, 14 videos. So it's going to be a long series creating this Flappy Bird game, but it's going to be a great place for you since you're just starting out. I'll go slow. We'll talk about everything as we go, and you can hit me up with any questions or suggestions for the game as we make it together. But that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for joining me, and as I like to say, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later.